To introduce Bill Tait. He's done important work in proof theory. But first he started off working in proof theory and defending and doing mathematical work in constructivism. But then through a philosophical critique of constructivism, he emerged into set theory and did important work in set theory. And that's where I really first encountered his work. He was in Lake Como and we had correspondence. Through that correspondence, he essentially advised my dissertation. And then he's also done work on major philosophical figures, so the principal figures of Plato, Dedekind, Cantor, Gödel, and Wittgenstein. And that philosophical work is part and was responsible for the move from constructivism to set theory. And one of the things that he's discussed a lot in connection with those thinkers is the question of realism, which touches on Charles Parsons. And today he's going to talk to us about in defense of the idea.
Like Saul, I met Charles first at the Cornell conference in Ithaca in 1957. And from that time, both a friendship and a philosophical exchange grew, the first of which I treasure, and the second of which has been invaluable to me in my work in philosophy especially. When back in Chicago, when I was thinking of preparing to come to this conference, it occurred to me that every time I'd been in Israel, Charles was there. And then it occurred to me that's also not a bad comment on my philosophical career. Charles was there. So I thank Charles. And I also thank the organizers of this conference in honor of his 80th birthday. Thank you very much. And also for inviting us. I want to outline an argument that intends to undermine a certain form of skepticism about mathematics. Well, listen, I have some slides for quotes, but I'm fairly inept at putting them up. Is that something we could do quickly?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I either could give you a flash drive or put it on. Good, that's best. So that's the, is that your note here? Okay.
Okay.
We do the full page?
Then I can do it with these, I do the other.
I'll show you. When you print it, or do you want to fit it, shrink it or not?
Thank you so much.
I remember having to print it. All right. See the other side too?
Anyway, what I want to do is to outline an argument that intends to undermine a certain form of skepticism about mathematics. This skepticism hangs on the fact that mathematics is about ideal things, numbers, sets, functions, and so on, structures, concerning which the objective knowledge of which our sensory experience is entirely irrelevant. Precisely because of this irrelevance, the skeptics holds that we cannot meaningfully speak of or know anything about ideal things or about mathematical objects. I first wrote about this topic in 1986 in the paper Proof and Truth, the Platonism of Mathematics. In writing it, I had the sense of diving into deep waters well beyond my initial interest in foundations of mathematics.
So do you want to show us the next slide where you have the article?
Where I have
An arrow.
oh yes, thank you. Keep up the good work.
I saw it already.
When I retired 10 years later, further pursuit of the topic was first on my agenda, and alas, it still is. There have been those from Aristotle in 4th century BC to Quine in our time, and his followers in the 20th century, who have denied that mathematical objects are ideal in this sense, who believe that in one way or another, truth about the natural world is relevant to mathematical truth. But in all of its forms, this view has squared badly with mathematics, both as it was in Aristotle's time and as it has been ever since. And it seems fair to say that to see it as a failed attempt to avoid the skepticism applied to mathematics while accepting the skeptic's argument. Others, such as Poincaré and Brouwer, in more recent times, and at least partly influenced by the skeptic's argument, have attempted to place the objects of mathematics, if not in the domain of our outer experience, at least in the domain of our inner experience in the mind. There are also those who accept that mathematical objects cannot be reduced in any way to the empirical, but for that reason relegate mathematical theories to the realm of pure formalism or fictions or whatever. The effect of the skepticism has not been confined to philosophers, but has been felt throughout history by mathematicians themselves in the form of reaction to the introduction of new kinds of objects. For instance, the introduction of the various extensions of the number systems historically, and especially in the 19th and first half of the 20th century, the introduction of the actual infinite. By saying that mathematical objects are ideal, I mean that the mathematical propositions, including the existential propositions, can be true, and that their truth values are independent of facts about the natural world. In ancient Greece, where the ideality of mathematics seems to have been first conceived, the language of mathematics included the language of Euclidean geometry and number theory, in some sense of language. For our purposes today, we may think of it as the language of first or second order number theory or the language of set theory, although there are alternative languages which express the same mathematics. Both individually and, we can suppose, as a species, language began for us with the everyday language of observable things and events, and it remains basic to our linguistic activity. The explicit introduction of ideal objects seems to have been very late coming in the development of language, as far as we know, in 4th century BC Greece. Even the grammatical categories of talk about the ideal derive from the grammar of talk about natural things. But this is an issue concerning priority, not ontology or epistemic legitimacy. The step from animal recognition of sensible objects and sensible properties to language in which we conceptualize and communicate with each other about them and their workings was large and indeed decisive in the development of our species, I would suppose. But in the search for further patterns in these workings and to state laws governing them, we were led to idealize, and from that, inevitably, to the consideration of ideal things. That was a large step, too, endowing us with, as Richard Dedekind wrote, a creative power approaching divinity. Dedekind sometimes wrote as though it were the ideal objects that we created, which of course doesn't make much sense. What we did create over time was a language, a discourse, in which we could speak of them. The skepticism to which I'm referring results from the general view that conceptual reference to objects, and more generally conceptual knowledge about them, presupposes that they are given to us in some way non-conceptually, or at least are of a kind that can be given to us in this way. In contrast, for example, the natural numbers can be given to us conceptually. We can characterize, as we've just seen, the system of natural numbers to within isomorphism as simply a simply infinite system, and then each number can be explicitly defined relative to that system. But obviously, the skeptic would not appreciate this kind of givenness. I should say that I'm using the term conceptual here in the objective Fregean sense. Concepts are something that we can share equally and communicate about with each other, so that when I speak of being able to refer to an alleged kind of things M, I mean that we can refer to them by name or describe them or refer to them collectively by expressions such as all M's, some M's, etc. in our common language. And by conceptual knowledge about them, I mean propositional knowledge. So the skeptic is insisting that linguistic reference to an objective propositional knowledge of objects presupposes that the objects are of such a kind that can be given to us non-linguistically. My focus on objective meaning and objective knowledge runs counter to much of current discussion of language and knowledge in the philosophical literature, in which the focus is on personal meaning and personal knowledge, what I mean by what is said and what I know. My switch from private to public does not reflect simply a desire to change the subject. Rather, it's motivated by the conviction not only that the public cannot be reduced to the private, but that private meaning and knowing cannot be understood in isolation from the public. In this, I'm sharing, in general terms at least, the anti-individualism of Tyler Burge. But the exact flavor of my anti-individualism derives, as will emerge from my reading of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. There are elements of irony in taking the existence of things in the natural world, of tables and chairs, as unproblematic, while questioning the existence of ideal things. Some of the so-called Socrates paradoxes strike right at the consistency of our notion of a physical object. Now I have to figure out what you're... There you go, yeah. Take this one. So I have a piece of chalk. I'm old-fashioned. I began teaching in the age where they used chalk and chalkboard. But I think you probably know what a piece of chalk is, right? Yeah. Little stick, you brush it, and a little bit of it rubs away. And so I brush it. I have this stick S, and I brush it, and I get S prime. Well, I want you to agree that S and S prime are still the same piece of chalk. If you don't, then I'll brush a little more lightly, or maybe just blow on it. But anyway, unless you're going to deny a very useful notion of a physical object, you're going to say they're the same physical objects. Okay? And, well, the story is clear. I can do that again and again and again until I've reduced the chalk to something that no one would agree was equal to the original. Besides inconsistency, we might challenge the existence of objects of the ordinary sense experience on physical grounds. When we magnify the visual field a billion times, what we call a physical object in the ordinary sense disappears and is replaced by a loosely organized and indeterminate cloud of atoms, with new atoms joining the cloud, others flying off. Precisely what set of atoms corresponds to this at this moment, say, to my body? Note that, well, let me leave that aside. In passing to the world of atoms, things like tables and chairs no longer exist except as ill-defined configurations of atoms. Of course, if we were willing to sacrifice our rather useful traditional notion of physical objects, the atoms themselves could, at this level, be taken as the new physical objects. But scaling even larger, the parts of atoms are revealed, for which the notion of physical object with a definite location and motion ceases to be applicable. The point of the story is not, of course, to undermine talk about the existence of tables and chairs or of atoms, but rather to shake up a bit, at least in a preliminary way, the grounds upon which their existence is taken to be unquestionable and the existence of ideal things is questioned. A natural view of language and how it works seems to reinforce the skepticism. It is the view of language as representation of objects, events, facts, etc., and evolves around the idea that words name things and that the relationships among the words, say in an elementary proposition at least, expresses a certain relationship among the corresponding named things. The sentence being true and the latter relationship holds. I will refer to this as the representational conception of language. As long as we're considering language only in its static descriptive function, which indeed is our primary interest, there's nothing wrong with this picture as a program for describing the semantics of language. The truth definition relative to a model for a formal language in the framework of predicate logic shows how it works for the straight-laced fragments of language that can be regimented into such a framework. Of course, language serves other functions in our lives other than this representational one, but it's a mistake to think that even where it applies, the semantics provides the ultimate account of meaning of words in the sense of indicating what the language, what the individual needs to know in order to understand our common language. And this point is also made by David Lewis. I won't read the comment, but let me present it. The view that semantics does yield an account of meaning in our sense assumes that this or that domain of discourse is given to us as a well-discriminated structure upon which the elements of which we hang our words, and is given to us extra-linguistically since it is already supposed for the understanding or use of language. A clear example of this point of view may be found in Paul Benasser's paper, Mathematical Truth, from 1973, which was, in fact, one of the explicit targets of my Proof and Truth paper. Benasarif writes the following. I favor a causal account of knowledge in which for X to be that, and so on. An obvious difficulty with the truth definition as an account of meaning, in our sense, is that it's given in a meta-language. What is the meta-language of English, for example? Wittgenstein, who himself in his earlier Tractatus offered a version of the static representational concept of language, refers it in the investigations rather unfairly to Augustine's Confessions, which he quotes in section 1. I'll give you the quote, but I don't think we need to dwell on it. In section 32 of the investigations, Wittgenstein sums up what's wrong with the representational conception as an account of meaning. Augustine describes the learning of human languages as if the child learning a language came into a foreign country and did not understand the language of the country. That is, as if he already had a language, only not this one. When we think about the relation of language to reality, i.e. semantics, we are such children perforce. Armed with my command of English, I view and can describe the natural world as having more or less definite structure, consisting of objects of this or that sort, having this or that property, and entering into this or that relationship. So faced with questions of the reference of words in some other language, I can answer by referring to kinds of objects, propositions, properties, and relations in my own language. I can translate. Of course, the other language might fail to make distinctions that can be made in our language. Then we have what Klein called indeterminacy of translation. But when instead of a foreign country, we're at home and the language is our own, when in Klein's terms, again, we go domestic, we're in a circle. We can no longer be thinking about translation, and so questions that we ask may become silly. The reasonable question of what the native speaker of an exotic language means by the word gavagai becomes the odd question of what we mean by the word rabbit. It's as though we have another language buried in our psyche, which we refer to in our usage of the word. But there's a possibility there's a misunderstanding of this point that I want to make in quoting section 32. And here I'm actually not certain about Wittgenstein himself, what he meant with respect to the issue. The passage perhaps contains the suggestion that the child in no sense discriminates objects in its environment, re-identifies them, recognizes their properties or changes in their properties prior to the learning of language. If that is what Wittgenstein meant, and there's some reason, I'm afraid, to think that it is, then he is on the wrong side of history, as the politicians say. And moreover, he certainly never observed a child learning language. I would certainly not want to follow him there. Beginning at least with Aristotle's own interpretation. Listen, I should find out when I started all of this, so I don't go on and on and on forever. And what?
You have to pause it.
Need to stop it?
I started at...
Oprah.
I don't know, you have plenty of time.
I have plenty of time. No problem. Yeah, no. Okay.
About a half an hour more.
Okay. So I was saying, in beginning with, at least with Aristotle's own interpretation, the investigation of notions of meaning and understanding, grasping meaning, has been bound up with the idea of mind as the intermediary between words and that to which they refer. Meaning is conferred on my words by what, in some sense, I have in mind when I utter them, And what I have in mind is a result of my interaction with whatever it is, object, property, fact, to which I'm referring. And we have more or less successfully communicated when that meaning coincides more or less with what you have in mind when you view them. On the view of meaning as located in the intervening mind, meaning and understanding are the same thing. My meaning when I'm speaking and your meaning when you are understanding. So to talk about meaning and understanding is to talk about individual meanings internal to the agent, whether speaker or auditor. From this point of view, and quoting one of its prominent contemporary advocates, John Searle, the philosophy of language is a branch of the philosophy of mind. I didn't write this thing down, did I? No. It draws considerable apparent support from what we may call the view from inside, from our own introspective sense of autonomy, that the meaning of the words I speak is the meaning which I endow them with. Of course, this would seem to imply, wouldn't it, that the meaning of your words is the meaning which you, not I, endow them with. One might also call this view of meaning, that meaning is in or conferred by the mind in all of its forms, the Aristotelian point of view, not only because of the source on interpretations, but because of Aristotle's insistence on the autonomy of substances. There are no relations among substances that are essential to any of them. Just as Aristotle's physics held that a change of state, including natural locomotion of a substance, is something entirely internal to the substance and not something defined only relative to its environment, the position in question holds that the meaning of what one says is something entirely internal to the agent. If I speak meaningfully or understand what is said to me, this is a fact about me in its essence independent of what's external to me. Being rational is somehow about me essentially and is not to be explained by my functioning as a well-behaved unit in some vast network of interactions and communication. One inevitable consequence of this view is that languages are essentially private, idiolects. We each have our own language, and communication amounts to a handshake across idiolects. A crucial difficulty with this view is it fails to account adequately for the objective norms that describe and sometimes even govern our use of language in communication. If the only thing I know about Groucho Marx is that he wrote Das Kapital, then my mind is a poor reference for the meaning and so truth value of the sentence Groucho Marx wrote Das Kapital. In fact, when my error is pointed out to me, I blushingly stand corrected, not for the sake of a handshake, but because I quickly learned that I was simply wrong in my use of a name in our common language. We may adjust to each other's idiosyncrasies in speaking, say, English, but the foundation of our communication is that we both are English speakers. You speak to an audience in English, and the members of the audience are listening to English. One might want to argue that the displacing of names is a minor transgression from the public norms. I merely mistranslated incorrectly a name from the internal language of my mind. But Wittgenstein's discussion of rule following, which has far wider application than just following rules, cuts much deeper. I'll say more about this point soon, but Saul Kripke clearly states the conclusion of Wittgenstein's argument and in a particular case, in the case of a particular example. So we have two functions, plus and plus, which give the same values for arguments up to a certain level, and then there's a problem of, well, what on what grounds is it correct to choose one the 1 plus over plus, even though you're treating both as being given by the same recursive definition. And Rigby's conclusion is, what? When I respond in one way rather than another to such a problem, I can have no justification for one response rather than another. There is no fact about me that distinguishes between my meaning plus and my meaning plus, and so on. And this could be, there's no fact about me that I'm referring to blue and not to blue or whatever. The application of this principle goes well beyond this idea goes well beyond just the case of rule following. Kripke counts this as a statement of a skeptical paradox, but it's that only if one begins with the assumption that some fact about me justifies my response. In fact, Wittgenstein's argument should be read as a refutation of exactly that assumption. That's what he meant. That's what he meant when he writes in section 201. This was our paradox. I'll say more about 201 in a minute. In opposition to, this is right. I'll be with you in a minute. In opposition to the view from the inside, and drawing, as I said, on the thread of arguments running through the investigations, I want to support a view from outside. Language is not a system of idiots, but a social activity, and what words mean is a question ultimately not of what goes on in individual minds, but of the role that words play in linguistic interchange, of how they are used in the linguistic community. And that is something that is there for all to observe. Thus, I'm accepting a version of the formula meaning is used, which of course is not really a quotation from Wittgenstein, but it is essentially the view of language that I think it expresses unsuitably understood the view that he has of language as I read it. But note that when I speak of use, I'm not referring in any way to mental states. I'm referring only to the extensional behavior of the language user. And whether or not a person understands the words, or better, the degree to which they understand, is also there for everyone to see. For it is a question solely of the extent to which the person's usage is in accordance with the meaning, with the communal usage. Let me emphasize that behavior is a criterion not because the person's usage is evidence for an internal state, say an intentional state, but because understanding the word is nothing but the disposition or propensity to use and react to them appropriately. And the criterion for that is the person's actions and nothing more. Again, it's important to note here that I'm using the term act or action in the extensional sense. Turning on the lamp and throwing the switch are the same acts. This distinguishes the view that I want to support from others, for example, John McDowell, who would accept the above formula, meaning is use, but would infuse the notion of a linguistic act and therefore of linguistic use with an intentional element. Extensional, intentional with an S. The intentional with an S in the case of McDowell's view is the element of his intention with a T, right? So I can't pronounce well enough to make the distinction between the two. It follows from this that speaking about meaning makes an implicit reference to a linguistic community, and so on. I say more about that, but I think that's obvious, and I'll just read it for the sake of time. Also, I don't hesitate to confuse somewhat the boundary between language and theory. Our ordinary language about physical objects has a theoretical side. It's implicit in our use that these objects have a unique position, for example, that if one object is taller than A is taller than an object B taller than C, then A is taller than C, and so on. And in the other direction, one speaks meaningfully of the language of mathematics, for example, as a language. I've noted that on the idiolect conception of language, meaning and understanding, that is grasping meaning, are essentially the same thing. Speaker's meaning versus hearer's meaning. According to the view from outside, they are of course significantly different. Given our position that linguistic meaning is ultimately explained in terms of use in the extensional sense in the community, the second part of our thesis is forced on us, that the only criterion for whether or not an agent understands a linguistic expression, i.e. grasps its meaning, is what he or she would do with it. Again, in the extensional sense, in other words, do with it as a user of the language. There is, of course, an implicit holism here. Understanding the expression presupposes some level of understanding of the language. Wittgenstein sums it up. I guess I could have told you. Yes. To understand a sentence means to understand a language. To understand a language means to have mastered a technique, to know what to do. Clearly, there's no threshold of understanding, level of understanding. Understanding whether it's an expression or a rule, a language, a theory, is a matter of degree. We understand it to the extent that we use it and react to it in suitable ways. So there are no Cartesian absolutes here. What counts as suitable in this respect obviously defies description. At what point do you give a student an A and say he understands addition on the basis of a test and so on? I mean, it's arbitrary. Let me skip that. Thus, I'm taking the position that understanding language is simply being disposed to use and react to it more or less correctly. Viewed solely as a state internal to the agent, linguistic competence is nothing more but a complex system of dispositions or propensities to act and react in certain ways. The sole criterion for whether or not one has such a disposition is how one in fact acts or would act in, again, the extensional sense. This is what Wittgenstein meant when he wrote, again, now I'm completing or adding to the part in section 201, that what it meant when he wrote this. For what we thereby show is that there is a way of grasping a rule which is not an interpretation, but which from case to case of application is exhibited in what we call following the rule or going against it. For following the rule, you could substitute things like applying a color word or all kinds of other. So Kripke wasn't quite right. There is something about us that distinguishes us from meaning plus rather than plus. It's a disposition. Presumably, the day may come when we'll have some way to actually to find the mechanisms of such dispositions, mental or neural mechanisms that would explain our dispositions. The specific issue in this passage is understanding rules, but I've said that. Of course, having a language is more than just having a complex system of dispositions to use and react to sounds and marks. The dispositions need to add up to a competence, say a competence in English. And here my anti-Aristotelianism is showing. What makes it a competence is nothing internal to the agent. Rather, it is what the dispositions are. It is that the dispositions are in conformity with the communal linguistic practice. Linguistic competence is not a property of an agent in isolation. It makes essential reference to the linguistic community. Going back to the quote from Kripke, uncovering the mechanism governing or adding numbers is not uncovering the grounds upon which the additions are correct. It's only uncovering the grounds of how the person is acting. It's possible that the sheer complexity of the network of dispositions to act and react that are involved in what we would judge to be linguistic competence has led many to postulate something in the mind that is outside the scope of ordinary natural science, intentions perhaps, to account wholesale for our linguistic competence. Just as the sheer complexity of many systems that have evolved in nature has led people to postulate that they did not evolve naturally, but are the creatures of an intelligent designer. But the black box of intentionality, like the black box of intelligent design, blocks off the search for truly informative accounts of complex phenomena. Notice that I say, has led many to postulate here. Surely the idea that there is an unnatural something in the mind, then let me start choosing. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if
Yes? Yes, let me read this up. When I say that as many to postulate this something, this internal something, surely the idea that there is an unnatural something in the mind that accounts for the meaningfulness of our linguistic behavior, something other than simply the dispositions to behave thus and so, is suggested by the fact that we sometimes are consciously meaning or intending something. But however that conscious meaning or intending is to be understood, it is far from accounting for very much of our linguistic behavior. Searle himself pointed out that in order to provide a full account, we must admit of intentions of which we're unaware. For example, in reading these lines, there's no conscious meanings or intentions behind my reading, simply reading them. In the same sense, I simply wrote them. When I'm balancing my accounts, I'm generally not consciously intending to do arithmetic. If I'm thinking about anything, it's more likely to be how I managed to spend so much money. Once in a while, one gets confused and consciously appeals to rules for adding, or more likely subtracting numbers, in order to get back on track. And once in a while, we appeal to rules to convincing others, such as students. But for the most part, when we act linguistically, we're acting unreflectively, even when we're conscious. When I follow a rule I do not choose, I follow the rule blindly. I wanted to say something then about a particular reaction to this reading of Wittgenstein, and leading to the view that Wittgenstein himself could not give any reasonable account of linguistic norms, of rights and wrongs of linguistic use. I could mention here these all rather early works on, well, I guess this is after 50, these two, but these early works in which, in one way or another, Kripke is viewed as, Wittgenstein is viewed as an empiricist, as someone who can give an account of logical grammatical norms. McDowell's rejected this kind of empiricist interpretation of Wittgenstein, attributing to him a view that McDowell himself defends. He agrees with Wittgenstein that suitably understood meaning is use, and that as understanding is competence, but for him use is no longer to be understood intentionally, and competence viewed as a property of the agent no longer refers simply to dispositions to act in a suitable way. And so there's a kind of unnatural notion there, but I should skip that. Okay, but anyway, a second nature, the object that McDowell was talking about, outside the logical space of causes, in other words, natural science, is not needed to account for norms and the role that they play in our linguistic lives, or therefore to save Wittgenstein's position from skepticism about norms. Within the linguistic community, there simply is a regular use of language. That's what makes it a linguistic community. On top of this, there simply is also a level of agreement about various linguistic rights and wrongs, about what we should or should not do linguistically, about correct word usage, grammatical, logical constructions, and so on, and in facts. But this agreement is not a result of an empirical investigation of what members of the community actually do. Indeed, as we who have been teachers well know, in many cases of linguistic rights and wrongs, it runs counter to which most of the majority of members of the community actually do. Knowing the rights and wrongs of language, being able to evaluate linguistic behavior, is just another level of knowing the language itself. And being a member of, we not only can add numbers, but we can check whether a computation is correct. We not only know that 2, 4, 6, up to 1,000, 1,002, 1,004 is the right way to go, but we know that 2, 4, 6, 1,000, 1,002, 1,006 is wrong. Following Wittgenstein, I've already suggested that the role of norms in our linguistic and rational life tends to be severely overblown. We're not walking rule books. Once in a while we consult the rules, or at least think about them, either to guide ourselves or convince others, but for the most part we simply act unreflectively. Language is, of course, an empirical phenomenon, and what counts as right or wrong in linguistic usage is a contingent matter. It might have been otherwise. One might, for that reason, feel that the laws of logic or arithmetic, for example, are contingent, that they might be otherwise. But there's a confusion here. What we may conclude from Wittgenstein's argument to be contingently true is not that this or that sentence, but rather is not this or that sentence, but the fact that we use the constitutive terms in the sentence the way we do. Indeed, the fact that we use any expression in the way that we do is always a contingent fact. But this in no way implies that in using constituent expressions in the way we do, we are not expressing a necessary truth. In particular, it's an empirical contingent fact that the sentence 2 + 2 = 4 is a meaningful sentence. That and in fact is a true one. But it's not an empirical fact that 2 + 2 = 4. This is at least part of what Wittgenstein meant when he wrote. So what you are saying that human agreement decides what is true and what is false. That's exactly the empiricist position that the authors I was mentioning were attributing to Wittgenstein. But he's rejecting that. He's saying it is what human beings say that is true or false, and they agree in the language they use, and that's not an agreement in opinions, but in a form of rights. No, I think I'd better. minutes of it. Then I want to just say that the view that then becomes forced on you if meaning is to determine reference is that is this view of what a word signifies. Well, the context of signifies here includes reference. Okay, so the word could be a name, and what's meant by signifies is what it actually refers to. And what the word signifies is shown by the kind of use that it has. This is a kind of a restatement, but enriching of Wittgenstein's so-called context principle. And to quote Dummett, I don't need that yet. To quote Michael Dummett, it's an enrichment in two ways. One, Wittgenstein's use of the notion of the context principle implies there's a notion of sense already for propositions. Okay, there's a notion of meaning of propositions. And secondly, but he doesn't ever explain that. I mean, I think that's a problem of exactly Wittgenstein's position, especially in connection with the context principle. The other is that there's no real account of grasping of meaning, of understanding in that sense. And what Dummett is pointing out is that in this way, this statement, really a paraphrase of statement of part 10 of the investigation, fills in that along with Wittgenstein's account of meaning as use and the account of understanding of meaning, grasping of meaning that we've given. I've gone on in the paper to mention Dummett's earlier statements about Frege context principle in his paper on Platonism, which is a very different account. And my feeling is that this paper was written at the same time he wasn't really understanding what Wittgenstein was saying, and that in fact the reversal of his own position is just that in understanding Wittgenstein's position on meaning and grasping of meaning, he then was able to understand the context principle in the right way and understand that the bold thesis is still bold, but it's not. But it's a thesis that can be held with the context principle. Well, I think I should stop there. That in a way is mainly the story of why one is able then to speak about ideal things, why there's nothing in the notion of language, meaning that an objection is raised by the fact that numbers are defined conceptually. This picture of language supports existential quantifiers over numbers as well as over physical objects. The one thing I regret not being able to talk about were the typical kind of objections to this point of view. One being a kind of an overpopulation objection. If you accept the context principle, then why can't you introduce all kinds of odd ontologies? For example, the present king of France, and so on. Well, you know, I think that that Cantor answered that question once. The answer is that don't fear if people introduce an ontology and it's of no interest or no use to anyone, it just won't be accepted. If somebody down the hall starts creating a whole new mathematics that no one can understand and seems to have no use, don't worry about it, he won't get tenure. So there's no need for police about this notion. The point is, a kind of discourse will be introduced only if it becomes interesting and important to you. A good example of a case where this failed was Minot, who thought that maybe by introducing impossible objects, he would somehow be able to simplify one's conception of language and meaning. It just didn't work, so it died. I hear Joseph.
A couple of years ago, I read an actually somewhat interesting book by a Polish philosopher developing what he at least took to be a Minomian conception. Now, I think the impossible objects might not have been quite objects in the sense that we think of them. They were really just shadows of certain properties, or intentions, or what have you. But at least he had found Minon suggestive in doing what he did.
There's an account of them by another Parsons, philosopher Parsons.
Yeah.
This
one, the one that I read recently, is somewhat different
from Terry's. The other problem that I wanted to talk about was the so-called uniqueness problem, and that I think in a way is philosophically more interesting. We come back, for example, to the answer of what the numbers cannot be. So you have two representations in set theory of the natural numbers. I guess the first one is by the early recent Maylow and of course you can make up as many as you like. There'll be lots of them. And so this is a problem. So the numbers are ideal objects, so to speak, given just by their structural properties, by the fact that they form a simply infinite system. Okay, but there are lots of such things. Well, actually, the answer to that objection was given about a century earlier by Dedekind, who just said it's none of these things. They're sui generis objects. It's ungrammatical to think of numbers as sets. Sets have members. Numbers don't have members. The same kind of argument can be applied, I think, to many other kind of reductions within set theory, the notion of an ordered pair, a relation, function, ordinal, cardinal, and so on. These are all notions which can be understood sui generically. But on the other hand, it's often useful to represent them as sets, but that's nothing essential to them. There are other aspects of the uniqueness problem, but I'll leave it there and just stop.
Yeah, I have a question. What does it mean to, when you say to understand a language means to have mastered a technique, what does that mean in the case of open problems in mathematics? Where it doesn't seem like it seems like there's understanding of a problem anyway, but there's really what's the technique that is there to master? I don't.
Well, I mean, I think if you understand the problem, you can understand the problem without having to have a solution. I'm not following it.
Yeah. So you don't. So if you think of problem solving in mathematics, you might say, well, look, I've got a technique here. I can use this technique, and it allows me to solve the problem.
Take just a simple case, the Diophantine equation. You know what addition means. You know what multiplication means. Identity means. and you know what that means for variables to range over numbers and so on, then you understand the problem.
But since you don't have a solution.
But you know what, but I see, yes. You understand in the sense you know what to do in order to come to a solution.
Yeah, so in the case of an open problem, you don't know what the solution, you don't know what the solution is.
Well,
So-
I think I was suggesting that you do.
You have a technique when there's an open problem to solve the problem, or?
Not a technique for solving it. To say that meaning, to grasp meaning is to know how to use the language. Isn't to say that you have a way of solving open problems. It says that you know how to, in the ordinary sense that we do, you know how to go about looking for a solution by computing, trying this, trying that.
Yeah, it seems like that might be connected with ideal objects too. If you say there is a solution, there's a solution to an open problem, but you just don't know a technique for getting there, that would be a way of...
No, if there is a solution, yeah.
That would be a way of affirming, ideal truths or
Yeah.
something like that.
But look, I think somehow meaning is used has gotten displaced here. Meaning is used means I know what the language is. I know how to add. I know how to divide, multiply, so on. It doesn't mean that somehow it gives you a technique for solving all problems.
Okay.
Nina?
Can you say
Okay.
Could
sure. Can you say a bit more about the relationship in your view,
תקרב.
according to Wittgenstein and according to
I
your
don't
own
think you're
view,
quite talking.
יותר קרוב. למעלה, ימני.
about the relationship
No.
between verificationism and skepticism? Because you started with skepticism, and then you talked more about meaning skepticism, but skepticism is often about truth. And here, verificationism can be understood either way, or against skepticism because it constitutes truth, and we know what we legislate and what proof is, and there's no room for skepticism, but more often it's used as supporting a kind of skepticism. So how do you read Wittgenstein in that respect, and what's your view?
I don't know that he talks about. I don't know that he talks about verificationism. Does he?
Well, certainly against
Do I need this?
skepticism.
Well, okay.
Anyway, I'll speak louder. But I'm not sure how to answer that because I don't think that he takes a view about verificationism. No, I think that Michael Dummett, not in any of the things I've quoted,
Yeah.
at some point accepts as a kind of a broad formula, meaning as used, builds into that his understanding of meaning in mathematics in terms of introduction and elimination rules in natural deduction. So an account of meaning that in the case of mathematics would be intuitionistic
Right, yeah.
logic, and in a more general case would be something like verification.
Yeah, that's
Is that what you had in
what I-
mind?
yeah.
Yeah. Wittgenstein himself, I don't think says that. I mean, I think that Dummett was adopting a more general view, a less specific view that uses meaning, general formula, to a very specific kind of thing. But as I say, I don't think there's anything about that in Wittgenstein's writing, but I could be wrong.
Michael?
Okay, so shall I just try to speak loudly? So I want to ask about Dedekind and the issue that came up at the end about uniqueness. I found myself thinking when you first mentioned Dedekind and the creative power verging on the divine, you said, well, of course it's not creating objects, it's creating language. And what I was thinking is, well, with Dedekind there seems to be a further step having to do with categoricity proofs. where if you have a bunch of principles in a language such that you can prove categoricity, that would be creation of objects in a way in which you don't, if you don't have that. And furthermore, you might think that the existence of such categoricity has something to do with the sense in which we have something that is independent of the sensible world, because we know that these principles already determine the answers to everything in some logical sense. We don't have to go out and look for anything more. And I'm just wondering whether you want to put a little more emphasis on that when you're in the Wittgenstein stuff, because there could be lots of language where we have Wittgensteinian, non-individualistic agreement in a community, but if it's not categorical, that's going to be essentially different than the case of the ideal in mathematics, if you understand the data
Well, yeah, let me say, I mean, in the rush to finish without being disgracefully over time, I didn't get around to mentioning the fact that what Wittgenstein has to say about mathematics was time warp. I mean, he was speaking about mathematics in the 18th century, not even 19th century mathematics. So his views about mathematics had nothing to do with what interests me. On the other hand, on the thing of Dedekind, I guess Dedekind would say, look, I'm not creating new numbers. I'm only giving a foundation for arithmetic has been being done for centuries, and I'm only giving a foundation for that. I mean, there were two ways of looking at the question: what are the numbers? Both he and Frege asked that question. Frege answered the question by showing that there's something else. What Dedekind did was to show that they are by looking at their basic properties, and that's where categoricity comes in. It says, what categoricity says is that you don't have to look for any more principles that are specifically about the numbers. The rest of it's all about set theory, about what sets of numbers or what properties of numbers you want to take Saul's, to take Feffner's terminology to what properties of numbers.
So can I just ask Paul, I'll stop if there's, do you think that Dedekind's notion of the special role of categoricity is important in your defense of the ideal, or perhaps it's inessential? Or?
I don't think it's essential.
It's not essential.
I mean, I think the Greeks talked about the numbers in that and produced a theory of it. I mean, it was just a formalism. I mean, it was prior for ordinary life. But the question remained, of what in the end are the right principles of proof about numbers, and then that was the answer to
I once thought there might be a tension between some of the things you said about Wittgenstein, which you seem to agree with, and the defense in many of your writings of what you call, I think, free mathematics, phrase derived from figures like data and because so much emphasis was placed in your remarks on Wittgenstein and communal freedom, conforming to communal norms. But in a sense, what Kant especially did was not to conform with what seemed to be communal norms in his time. In a sense, I think what you probably ought to say is that he invented a new language as you interpret Dedekind's claim about free creation in that sense. Is that the direction you would want to go in the rest of this?
Well, what I think is that Wittgenstein was very conservative. I mean, it was about mathematics, but he had a very convenient phrase. If it was conforming to ordinary use, but he didn't like the use, he called it language on holiday. So set theory, although by the time he was writing in the late 1920s and the 1930s, was already a part of the warp and woof of many areas of mathematics, number theory, and so on. For him, set theory was language on holiday. So You know, he wrote somewhere, philosophy leaves mathematics alone. Philosophy leaves the world alone. But he wasn't leaving it alone. He was rejecting sector. The answer to that is he didn't think that was real mathematics. That this was some bad invention of Frege and Russell and so on. That went wrong.
I'm interested in the parts of Wittgenstein that you seem inclined to defend, and maybe not the situation in the 1920s, but the situation in the 1870s when Cantor was introducing transfinite numbers and beginning to talk very freely about infinite sets, even though there's nothing compared to what people do nowadays. That Cantor's behavior seems not to fit the picture of the use of language that you were painting in Wittgenstein's behalf. Unless I misunderstood you.
You know, there was a quote that I cut out of this paper in the vain hope that I would keep it within time limit, which is rather nice on this connection. Wittgenstein, at some place very early in the investigations, maybe like section 18 or something like that, compares language to a city. There's the old city, and then there are the extensions of it, the neighborhoods, and then suburbs and so on are added. He's thinking of things. One of the things he mentions is, you see, mathematics gives you an example of this. So we had this sense of language as something much more flexible. Yeah.
Peter and then Mark.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I have a question about realism. So one of the essential features of realism is the claim that mathematical objects are independent of us. And you're a realist and you have an account of independence. So the account of independence goes like this. When you take counterfactual, if our practice had been different, then there would still be infinitely many crimes. There's two readings. On the first reading, you countenance a situation in which you speak differently, and then you look at how they would assess the names. And then in the second reading, you look at a situation where they speak differently, but you use your home language here in assessing the claims. And since you've got that second reading, you can articulate a sense in which it is independent of changes in our practice, that there are infinite crimes.
Yeah, I think my example of 2 plus I had a 2 plus 3 equals 5 is an example of that. I mean, that meaning of that could be changed.
Yeah, I'm just using it.
But,
So I haven't got the question. I'm just
okay.
saying the background. Now you can use that to overturn a person's, like, to criticize a person like Saul's view, where he thinks intersubjectivity that objectivity in mathematics just boils down to intersubjectivity of social norms. Because when you countenance a change in social norms, like if our norms had been different, then it would be right to drive on the left-hand side of the road. You can't get that second reading. See, the norms are too tightly tied to the practice. So you've got an account of independence of mathematical objects, and I'm just wondering whether that, and it does well in distinguishing mathematics from social norms, but I'm wondering if it goes far enough, and if you think that it should go, that we can say something more about the sense in which mathematics is independent of us. Because the concern I have is that it looks like it's, this second reading is a sort of logical trick that you can apply to any domain. So if I just, introduce some artificial mathematical objects, or if logicism had been true and all of mathematics was reducible, then in those cases there's a sense in which we can talk about mathematical objects, and we always have the second reading. But upon reflection, we want to say it really doesn't get to the bottom of that.
Yeah. I mean, of viewing that you know that they are independent of us in this room has a lot to do with feeling about the fact that the logical constants have to mean what they mean. So what we really mean is that if you're going to express Boolean truth, for example, you have to have Boolean operation in the language. Am I making myself clear? I mean that it's that the language is that logic is that mathematics is supposed to be tied to logic. That you can't see how one could think differently about mathematics than the way we do, because it seems very hard to think differently about logic than the way we do. Like, you know, try again.
I think we're taking another shot at it. So, suppose logicism had been true. And we
What?
suppose logicism had been true.
Had been true or had been?
Had been true.
Had been true.
I'm assuming it's not.
Yes, okay.
And you could come up with a complete system for mathematics.
Yeah.
And so you can talk about natural numbers and the higher infinite and everything. Given that we had that reduction to logic, there would be a sense in which realism about those objects, the higher mathematical objects, wouldn't hold. There'd be a sense in which you don't have independence of that realm of mathematical objects. You can be a formalist. You can just write down your complete system and you're off to the races. So the fact that logicism failed seems to be an argument in favor of the independence of mathematical objects.
Logicism would be a translation of the language, our language of mathematics, into some kind of logical system. Right? I mean, that's the sense in which it would be reduced by the numbers. But we're talking about our numbers, and they might not be described.
The reason I'm mentioning this is because you can still do the two counterfactual readings in the first scenario where logicism is when you have a reduction, and the scenario we're in now where you don't have a reduction. And the fact that there's not a reduction seems to tell us something about realism about arithmetic. So the reading can't be doing all the work.
There's a question back there.
I think there was one from Mark earlier.
Is it done?
There's time for two very short questions.
All right, I'll try to make, I have so many things to say about this, because as you know, I've myself thought about Wittgenstein, and I actually surprisingly sympathetic to what you said. I found myself in agreement with so much of what you said.
Well, thank you.
That I'd like to make some suggestions. It's called chutzpah in Yiddish. I don't think, another thing, but I'll try to make it as short as possible. I don't think you have to talk about, dispositions, can you hear me? Dispositions at all when you give a Wittgensteinian account. Since I'm encouraged to hear you say that the use you're talking about is extensional use, I call this empirical regularities of behavior, but I think it's the same thing. Now, what I do have I would have the following problem, though, in extending this to arithmetic with very large numbers. And Wittgenstein himself talks about this, and this is also connected with intuitionism. I'll start by saying that Wittgenstein denounces intuitionism. It's a perversion of mathematics. It's complete bosh, as he. At the same time, there's something about the intuitionistic criticism of realistic mathematics, or even the ideal that bears looking at. No practice, no human practice can go on to infinity. And he mentions the fact that any human regularity will peter out as you go on. If you divide 1 by 7, you'll get a repeating decimal, but if you keep on going for 100,000 things, there will be a big deviation. If you take the pi and you expand pi, this won't go on forever. The agreement between people won't go on forever. And therefore, there's something different about the law of excluded middle and requires different rules. I mean, meaning is still used, but it's not the same as before. You mentioned we all know what plus is, we all know what minus is, well, therefore we know whatever. This is a non-Wittgensteinian point of view because there's no, as you pointed out, correct, I think there's no objective fact about knowing what plus means or what times means. This also has to be, okay?
Yeah.
All right, so when you get up into the higher ranges of finite mathematics, I'm not talking about set theory, which is another. The thing the meaning of these things collapses, and therefore, what mathematicians do, they impose new linguistic rules and new meanings on this. This is a long story. I think I've said enough right now.
One thing I wanted to mention, he does talk about disposition, but he uses the word in a different way. I use it in the sense of propensity. That is, I distinguish between the fact that the coin comes up evenly times heads from any kind of physical mechanism that accounts for that. Where he uses the term disposition for the mechanism itself.
No, he says that the disposition is irrelevant to rule following anyway because we know what disposition is.
No, if you use it to a term disposition the way I'm using it, as a propensity, then 201 expresses exactly what I meant to say.
This is a longer discussion.
I'm glad to report that the discussion can proceed over lunch.
This gentleman really did want to go away.
We can have one word in before lunch. You can.
I'm Dan Yasher from University of Haifa. I think it's a very important point that you raised over here about how we understand the meaning of our cognitions and the truth of our proposition to represent external reality. But Wittgenstein cannot help us in this because in his Tractatus, he assumes the meaning as a census of the metaphysical subject and the object and the facts in the logical space, and therefore the only problem is to show how they fit each other. In the investigations, he is actually phenomenalist. In the Tractatus, he is formal semanticist. In the investigation, he is a formalist. Is a phenomenalist, because we are actually prisoners in our language game. We cannot show how from the language game you can represent external reality. For example, how the infant can learn the language game if he doesn't understand language game. And this is a very important problem. Therefore, Wittgenstein cannot help us with this either. And what I'm suggesting that we have to show that in our perceptual operation, we quasi-prove the truth of our proposition, of our perceptual judgment, and therefore also the meaning of this perceptual judgment. And without extending can suggest that, okay, I can suggest that in mathematics, in arithmetics, we do the same. We actually use number as symbols of counting, and while we are counting 1, 2, and 3, we can add them and say this is a proof of our basics arithmetics. Thank you.
Lunch, everybody.